As I work my way down, I see hints of color in the lake. So what I'll do now is take some clean water and dampen the entire surface of the lake. Keep in mind, this wash is 100% dry. So I'm not running the risk of reactivating the color. That's important. Now I'm going to pick up very subtle hints of the color that I see. For example, a little of the green, and work the green in just to get the slightest suggestion of reflection. I'll pick up a little of the green here because I see a little of that. And I also see that this subtle green works its way into this area. Now, I'd like to continue with this idea over here, but my wash is already beginning to dry in areas, and if I touch them, like here, I'll get a back run. The paint may bleed in a funny way, so the safest procedure is to allow it to dry 100% again and then continue to work in. I can drop down to some of these boulders in this area. Why not? The lightest one is right over here. Yellow ochres, cobalt blue. Often I paint the rocks one at a time. Okay, this has a light cobalt blue wash for highlights. Some darker markings. Trying to get a little dry brush action on top of this. Get the feeling of texture. For the rocks, I can use a rather interesting approach. Here's a big one. I'll dampen it because I don't want the color to bite into the paper. Then it's mostly gray, so I'll pick up some of the neutral tint and just dab it on. Into that work some cerulean blue. Good. Then, quickly, with my plastic palette knife, scrape into the surface where I see some things that look like fractures in the rock, cracks. Drag the paint to create texture. I pressed hard and it's giving me some interesting lines. Then I can go back into it. In this case, I want to go in with a burnt sienna. Okay, so I have a nicely textured object there that suggests rock. Put my neutral tint into it. Then, once again, the top of the rock is cerulean blue. And then before it has time to dry, take my palette knife, press into it, scrape that color. Push down. Good, that's what I wanted. I want to create a little bit of a fractured look, and I'll leave it alone. Let it dry. I'm going to continue to work into the mountain, developing the shadows, and all the little subtle highlights, using the same techniques that you've already watched me employ. What's important to keep in mind is when you apply a wash, even of the same color, over an existing color, you darken that color. And that's a good way to develop shadows. And I'm applying additional washes of French ultramarine blue because I find it's an excellent shadow color. So I'm going to continue this type of work. off camera. But what I need to do now on camera is get some more of those beautiful subtle tones that we were talking about before in the water area. What I'll do now is dampen my colors. Clean out some of these bins that have become messy. Yeah. I'm ready to go. The colors I see in the photo are the light greens that pick up in the water. I actually see a little bit of magenta. So I'll get some of the magenta in there. And of course, there are some beautiful cobalt blues. Now that my subtle colors are prepared, I'm going to dampen the water once again. I've allowed the paint to dry. That enables me to re-dampen it. Not too much brushing. I don't want to activate the paint underneath. And now I can begin to apply the subtle hints of color that sort of suggest a little of the reflective quality. Neutral tint, cerulean blue. Take my palette knife, scrape into the surface. And there's lots of transparency in this part of the water. And I'm seeing rocks and stuff underneath. So let me do a few. And to do them, I have this rather interesting combination of browns, burnt sienna, neutral tint, and add a little bit more ochre to that. Good, I think that's the color I want. And what I'm going to do is begin to suggest what looks like rocks underneath the water. Lift out some of the color by working back in with a clean brush. To kind of lighten the tops, they seem to have highlights and shadows. So while the paint is still damp, I'm able to quickly lift it out with a clean brush. A little bit more gray. I'm just dabbing into my palette, picking up color that's laying around. You know, all of this color is useful. See, it's grays and blues. Perfect for the rocks. And of course, the lighter yellowish ochre rocks that happen to be in areas. Beautiful golden color. And I just dance around with my brush with this gray to kind of fill in the spaces and create the effect of stones. I want an irregular feeling of randomness. And I want to pick up all of the subtle colors that are there. And remember what we said about that area. I'm going to bring down some of those ochres. So I'll dampen it. Now that it's 100% dry, get a touch of yellow ochre. Beautiful color. and work it in. Not doing too much. I want it to intermingle on its own. Even a little dab of raw sienna may help. Let it dry. And we need this tree. And what color for the tree? Picking up French ultramarine blue. And into that, I'm going to mix Windsor yellow. That's for my darker green, but I also see a lighter green there, so I want to reinforce that. Once again, the Windsor yellow here. Very squiggly, broken branches and foliage. And into that, I'm going to put some of my lighter green mixture, because in nature and in my photograph that I'm referring to, I see variations in tone. I don't see one tone. I see lighter values that modulate to darker values. And I'm working my brush stroke to suggest the broken look that I see in the photo. Paying very close attention to the way the tree and the branches with the needles break up and allow you to see through them to the background. Sometimes I don't even mix my color. I simply apply the blues and the yellows and allow them to mix right on the paper, run into themselves on the paper. I also see in this spectacular tree hints of burnt sienna. To begin to suggest the ripples on the surface here, I'm simply using cobalt blue and moving my brush back and forth in a horizontal fashion. And I just like the way that dissolves and breaks up the ripples and suggests water surface patterns. And of course, as you move to the foreground, they become more dominant. And there is a bit of perspective going on. As the ripples recede into the distance, they become smaller and smaller. The best approach is to develop your watercolor using a wet into wet technique, but allowing each layer to dry and then superimpose detail on top of the layer that's dry. Going back into this area, there's a lot of much lighter green in there. I'm going to try a little aureolin yellow. What I'm going to need to do is carry a little bit of the trunk down into this area. That way. I also want to continue. I'm looking at the water and I see, and I added some little ripply effects with some darker color, a darker blue-gray, and I'm going to add them in the foreground. And then we have to deal with this area over here, the immediate foreground area that's going to provide nice contrast with the water and the background. To add some of these foreground ripples, I'm going to take my cobalt blue mixture and I'll begin to render. And the key is to do it in a way that it doesn't look artificial. I'm very subtly adding some of these just to create a little of that contrast in the foreground. In this area, they take on a burnt sienna quality. And some ripples of burnt sienna poke through over here. And then we cool off significantly. And I just play with the surface, move my brush around, make marks that sort of suggest what I'm seeing. There's a beautiful turquoise in the water. The turquoise seems to have as its foundation color cerulean blue. I have my cerulean blue, and I'm going to pick up the lightest tint of aureolin yellow. I want to dampen this area again. There's no danger of reactivating the color as long as I don't brush too vigorously and too much. Now I'm going to take the color I just mixed and work it in. And I allow some of the tones underneath to poke through to create the variety that you would see on a water surface. A little earlier on, I mentioned that I was going to mask out this area before I laid in the log, and that's what I'm about to do. I'm about to lay in the log. I want to protect these tiny little leaves so I don't have to carefully paint around them. I could just ignore them and wash my color over them for the log. And how do I do that? I do that with masking. So, I'm going to dispense a little bit of masking fluid into this piece of plastic lid. And with a fine, inexpensive paintbrush, just flowing on the masking fluid. As I mentioned in a previous video, you could easily clean off your brush with Windex. Wipe off the excess Windex and go back into my masking fluid. It's very important when using masking fluid to keep your brush clean of dry masking fluid. Notice how I dab it on. I don't really brush it. I use a dabbing type of action. Okay, can't do anything. Time to let that dry. About to lay in the big section of tree that we see here in the immediate foreground. That'll establish a wonderful contrast with everything else because it has sharp and dynamic range of values from light to dark. For the trunk of the tree, I'll be using a combination of burnt sienna, probably a little bit of brown matter, definitely some yellow ochre, and my neutral tint, and any other miscellaneous hint that I might see. Time to mist my palette. My palette is dry. Good. Much of the surface of this tree, because it's an old dead tree, has taken on a grayish, bluish, brownish range of color. And what I'm doing is I'm exaggerating some of the contrasts a little to establish a nice contrast with the water that's behind it. Now I'm going to go into my neutral tint And into the neutral tint, I'm going to flow a little brown matter. Pull it up with a dampened brush. I think what I would like to do is create a little texture like that. Yeah, good. That's about all. Some of this blue grade color, got to be careful because I don't want it to merge with the water. And then go right into my neutral tint. And the underside gets really dark, so we can do that. Hints of warmer browns in the deep shadow area of this. And the warmer burnt sienna. Just added a little blue down here, cerulean blue, to suggest the water splashes up underneath the log. My neutral tint and some other colors blended in. And I carry that over. Allow the masking to do its thing. Good. So you only see sections of the trunk as it continues down into this area. Let's grab the X-Acto knife and add some highlights. Nice sharp contrasts on the broken part of the wood. I don't use the point that often. I did along the edge, but I prefer to scrape along with the body of the blade because that gives a nice texture to the surface. Scraping right in to create a textured, irregular, sparkly surface. A slightly darkened mixture of greens and blues and grays, just to suggest some of these branches that come out into this area. And I'll take my darker green and just continue in here, very abstractly, to fill in that white space. I am into the final phase of the painting, and it's about time I remove the masking that I placed on top of the green foliage a while back. I like to remove masking with a kneaded eraser. I find it a very gentle way to work off the masking on watercolor paper. There we go. Revealing the colors that are underneath. Something to keep in mind. This is a relatively small sketch in my moleskin sketchbook. It only measures 5 inches by 8 inches. And because it is a sketchbook, sometimes I work from photographs like I did in this case. Often I'll go outside with my sketchbook and work from life. To create white detail like this or linear white elements, I don't rely on masking. I use the Signo permanent white pen to achieve that kind of detail. And I'm going to do so in this. I would never do this to a larger watercolor. A larger watercolor has to be the pure transparent watercolor technique, where I rely on the white of the paper to be the whites. I use this pen in this painting. If we zoom in and look at the mountain, there you go. It would be very difficult for me to articulate this with masking. It'd take too long. It'd be ridiculous to do this outside. Now I can bring this watercolor into the studio and turn it into a nice size, full sheet, 22 by 30 watercolor painting. And I would mask out all the light details so the white of the paper creates that beautiful detail. Having said that, let's zoom in and use the pen in areas. And you can see I already have. I couldn't wait. I started to accentuate the snow in the mountains with the white Signo pen. And I'll do a little more. But I still see a few little marks here and there. It's fine to use a tool like this in your sketch pad when you want to get the information down quickly. The painting is finished. I hope you enjoyed watching my watercolor painting demonstration on painting Lake Louise. Lake Louise is located in Banff, Alberta, Canada.